Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Brodigan, Alumni Relations Officer at Trinity Development and Alumni, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Inspiring Ideas at Trinity webinar on how to have a healthy housing system with guest speakers, Professor Ronan Lyons and David McWilliams. The talk today will last about 30 minutes and we'll leave plenty of time for audience questions. We do really encourage audience participation, so feel free to pop a question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout the webinar. Please note we're using Zoom AI-generated subtitles for this webinar, and if you'd like to turn those on or off, you can do so by clicking the CC closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available for later viewing on our YouTube channel. So now I'd just like to introduce our two speakers, who are both very well known. David McWilliams is an adjunct assistant professor at Trinity Business School, as well as a leading economist, author, journalist, documentary maker, and broadcaster. A graduate of TCD in economics with a master's in economics from the College of Europe at Bruges, he began his professional career in the Central Bank of Ireland. He subsequently spent a number of years in London working as an economist for UBS and BNP, specialising in emerging markets. Since returning to Ireland, he has worked in print and broadcast journalism, written numerous books on the Irish economy, and has authored plays and documentaries. Professor Ronan Lyons is an associate professor of economics at Trinity College Dublin, where he is also director of Trinity Research in Social Sciences. His research focuses on housing markets, urban economics, and economic history, and his doctorate at Oxford was on Ireland's housing market boom and bust of the early 21st century. He is a consultant to the International Monetary Fund on residential property prices, a frequent contributor to the national and international media on Irish housing and the broader economy, and the author of the quarterly daft.ie reports on the Irish housing market. So you're both very welcome, and I'd like to hand over to David now, who's going to lead and moderate our discussion today.
Thank you so much, Amy. You're all very welcome. Unfortunately, we can't do this in anything but the basement here, but it's great to be chatting to you. And also it's fantastic to have Ronan here with us, because he is clearly, as Amy said, one of the experts in what is Ireland's intergenerational failure, which is providing enough houses for enough people at the right price in the right place. Something that many other societies have certainly in the past seemed to have got right, and it has been evasive, let's say, for Ireland for years. So I'm going to get straight in there. I'm going to say, Ronan, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm very good, David. How are you doing?
I'm flying. I'm in great form, really good form. Listen, let's get into how bad, give me a sense of, and give everybody listening and watching a sense of the problem. How big is it? How bad is it? Before we talk about how we can create a healthy housing market for all. So let's get the bad news up front first, and then let's see what we do.
Yeah, well, I suppose I mean, the economists are famed for always trying to put numbers on things, right? So if you want to go straight to a number, even if we just take the Greater Dublin area, I don't want this to be Dublin focused, but if we just take the Greater Dublin area, that's probably missing close to between 400 and 500,000 apartments. That's the scale of and I use apartments rather than houses, because that's where the vast bulk of the missing housing is. To take a step back, I think most people who were in Ireland at some point over the last 30 years think about the Irish housing market in terms of the bubble and crash. And I want to suggest that the bubble and crash is a distraction from the bigger issue. And the bigger issue is if you suppose the bubble and crash weren't there and you were drawing this line of property prices, it would be kind of like a bobbling along line. And then again, just ignore the bubble and crash for a moment. And then in the early 90s, it starts to just do this. So something changed in the early 1990s. I mean, you try and put an exact year on it, but I don't think that's particularly helpful. It's more roughly speaking in the last 30 years or so, things have changed. And in particular, right, the worst part about this is it's a good news story. The country finally found a business model, after a century and a half without one. We were going to be a platform for, in particular, North American businesses to access the European market. That's great. It created lots of new jobs. We integrated fully into the single European market. We had all these kind of growing sort of indicators, but we had growing pains as well. As in, once you go from sort of a stable or falling population, and remember, there were fewer people at work in Ireland in 1991 than in 1951. Right, there was like 1.2 million people at work in 1951, 1.1 million at work in 1991. We now have 2.1 million people at work. So we've added we've doubled our workforce in 30 years. But then you've got to double all sorts of other things, or maybe not double, but you've got to increase infrastructure and housing. And the failure is a failure to add housing, in particular for smaller households and in particular in cities.
So let's talk about this idea, because I've always thought the idea of growing pains, it's like having a teenage son in particular, and you go and you buy them a pair of runners when they're 14 and a half, and by the time they're 14 and 3/4, they've grown up. So, and then the old traditional Irish way was buy shoes that are too big for the young fella before he gets to that stage, right? So that's the visual image you have in your head. Let's just talk about why you believe the reaction to a pretty extraordinary economic story. In actual fact, I don't think there's any Western country has gone through the same upswing as we have on almost every metric, whether it's even UN development metrics, or if you take about money and brass tacks itself. Why do you think that the housing market has betrayed the economy? Because that's what we're talking about. It's a betrayal.
Yeah, I think part of it comes down to that concentration of growth, and the catch up in Ireland happens in a more concentrated period. Like Kevin O'Rourke, who's ex-Trinity, and he's written a really interesting paper looking at kind of 100 years of Irish independence and kind of a review of its economic performance. And the funny thing is, if you go 1920 to say early 2000s, Ireland's growth was exactly overall was exactly, in terms of living standards, was exactly in line with what you'd expect, given how poor we were in 1920 and what happened elsewhere in Europe. The thing that was different was it all happened between the 1980s and the 2000s. That we were still sort of, 60% of Western European living standards as late as 1987. And we had this catch up. In other countries, by having the process over a longer period of time, and by being less concentrated in agriculture to start with, and they had better practice at doing density. They had better practice at building and rebuilding cities and taking existing plots of land and reusing them for a different purpose. Our trick in Ireland has basically been, anytime there's any population growth, just get the city to get a little bit further out. And then we built the motorways, and we're like, actually, we can send people down the motorways and they can live an hour away, and they can live in Longford, and they can live in Wexford and drive to Dublin. Yes. That's not necessarily how you would design a system from scratch. You'd allow people, and in fact, it's a stated policy goal to allow people to live close to where they work if they want. But we haven't actually achieved anything like that goal. And I think lots of countries have unhealthy housing systems at varying degrees. But ours is particularly unhealthy because we have this kind of concentrated growth, and at a time when countries like Ireland were used to limiting new housing supply.
And we limited new housing supply because people emigrated. We didn't even have to have it. But can I come back to just that thing before we get into the broader discussion? So you can argue that a country like Germany, for example, having been destroyed in 1945, has this extraordinary concentrated economic growth spurt, this Wirtschaftswunder they talk about, from 1950 to, let's say, 1970. Okay, in this period, the German population is beginning to grow again after the war. They get it right. They house their population commensurate with their economic growth at a time where they also managed to keep rents quite low, and they managed to actually make the system work. They're beginning then to absorb in huge amounts of immigration. Just, again, not to put you on the spot, but what's the difference between that experience of a growth spurt that I don't think anybody expected after the Second World War, and also off the basis of a destroyed public infrastructure, totally destroyed public infrastructure, and they get it right. And we, without the legacy of bombardment, get it wrong. I just want to, let's specifically look at the difference in those type of countries. So the growth spurt in Ireland can explain lots of things, but it doesn't negate the inactivity.
On its own, it's not the only part of the answer.
Yeah.
I think part of it is around timing as well. So if you have sort of concentrated economic miracle in the 1950s and into the 1960s. That's at a time before effectively large-scale control over, like policymaker control over who gets to build what where. In the 1960s, lots of countries with higher incomes, including Ireland, introduced systems of where what we might call, you and I have talked about this before, where the incumbents get maybe an oversized say in who gets to build what where. So if you live in an area, you get some say over the next door plot, even though the person who's going to live next door doesn't actually get the same say. And because Ireland's growth spurt was after the introduction of zoning and planning restrictions, not before. And in and of themselves, there's nothing wrong with, there's countries that have got zoning and planning systems and do it right. But the system we have with both common law and with the planning system and with the growth concentrated after, the common law means you don't have, like in Denmark, they have a system of master zoning to allow their cities to grow, and they have a land tax that sort of encourages the private sector to build what society needs. And they have more or less a tick box system. If you meet these criteria, you get to build. In Ireland, you can get planning permission. That might only be the start of the process, because then there could be, these days, is this thing called judicial reviews, where you could argue I have a right to light or whatever, and there's all this stuff that doesn't have precedent in a common law system, and then it has to go through the courts, and you can end up with projects being delayed by 18 or 24 months or longer. The famous one, given it's a Trinity talk, is there's two neighbours of Trinity Hall who have been objecting to an expansion.
Up in Milltown.
And that's some of the most expensive residential real estate in the country. Trinity, perhaps understandably, maybe I'd say this because of my role, but understandably wants to put more students on there. And there has been a 20-year legal battle around that. And I don't want to get anyone into trouble by naming any names or whatever, but that's symptomatic. And last year, just to kind of close out that anecdote, last year, one of the parties in that, they appealed to some, the next round of the blocking it. And the judge said, to allow this appeal would be to make a mockery of the finality of the planning decision. And within a month, the person's spouse had started a new, so technically it was a new person starting a complaint, and it was allowed to start all over again.
Okay.
And with that kind of, you put in all those elements, the timing of our growth, the nature of our legal and planning system, that combination means that we're stuck in a system that can't provide enough housing given our needs. Okay,
well, I don't really want to close down this discussion right now on the basis that we're stuck in a system that can't give our needs. So how do you change that system? So let's talk about, in the ideal world, okay, remember you started with this idea that you're kind of taken by surprise by a growth spurt. You're taken by surprise by the fact that the economy generates jobs. You're taken by surprise that we have immigration, although you shouldn't be, right? Superimposing that as a legal system which is biased towards the incumbent, the person who actually owns, and then you have a legal system which genuflects to the rights of the individual because it hasn't got this mass planning idea. So taking that we've inherited a legacy of poor issues that will make it very difficult for us to move ahead, what do you do now? Because the reality is the 400,000 to 500,000 apartments that you speak of that are lacking in Dublin, in the greater Dublin area, are not only 4 to 5,000, 100,000 people, they're probably about 600,000 people if you look at the composition of families, etc. What do you do about it? I mean, these are citizens, brothers, sisters, sons, daughters who are locked out of the system now.
So yeah, let's turn to the optimistic side. It's great fun to diagnose the problem, but let's start talking about solutions.
Yeah, exactly. So what do we do?
So I would argue, and let's look at, say, where Ireland was as the crash had sort of happened, and we were looking at the housing system and going, how do we shape the housing system to make sure that we don't have this bubble crash again, but that we get the right amount of housing in the right places? I would see 4 ingredients to a healthy housing system.
Okay, let's go. This is where we want to get to. Okay.
The first is having a healthy credit system, right? And this is sort of learning the lessons from the last war. Without necessarily kind of getting overly focused on it, but making sure that lending, and therefore house prices, as in we think of when you buy a property, that they're connected to the real economy. And the central bank introduced rules in 2014 that try and sort of do that. We had a system with building societies that we didn't know was doing it, but it was macroprudential before macroprudential was a thing. It was controlling house prices, linking them to the real economy. Now, when we got rid of building societies, very quickly afterwards, we had excess credit, and then we had a classic kind of bubble crash episode. So the central bank is largely on this, and they're reviewing the rules, but they basically limit the borrowing relative to your income, and therefore you're limiting sale prices relative to your income. But the problem is that housing supply is not about that link. If you can think of it as call prices P and call, this is like my lecturer hat on now, call income Y, because that's just economists do, they call it Y for some reason. This kind of P-Y relationship is really important for the health of the economy, but supply isn't about P and Y, supply is about P and C, costs, right? If prices are below costs, then you're not going to get supply, even if they're at a healthy level. And I think that characterizes the Irish system, the Irish housing system over the last 10 years, is that that the effective cost of providing new homes is far too high, and therefore we're getting really unresponsive housing. And there's two elements to that, which is the kind of the second and third bits. One is around land costs, and that gets into the discussion we just had. What can you do with the site? And I think there's a silver bullet there, or as close to a silver bullet as you're going to get in policy, which is a land value tax. And we can come back to that one. But the other one is government ownership of an understanding of the cost of building, the actual construction cost if you have a site. It's very expensive to build a home in Ireland, and the government doesn't really know why, and often disputes that that's the case. And if it acknowledges it's the case, it says, well, that's the sector's problem, it's not our problem. But if you set the wage rates, if you set the minimum specifications, the government basically sets the cost of construction. So it can't just say it's nothing to do with us. And that, I think, is the big area where policymakers can have a real impact over the next couple of years in improving the health of housing.
Okay, Carl, I want to go back to you on the cost of housing, because I mean, this is something that intrigues me as an economist, but also frustrates the hell out of people as potential buyers. And it's the idea that usually the economy should balance. So by and large, your major cost in any venture is your labor cost. It should be about 60%. And that's your kind of fundamental base price against which everything rotates or should rotate. What we have in the case of Ireland is that Irish wages, although rising, are not rising anywhere near the cost of property, the end cost of property.
Yeah.
So in some way, property has disentangled from what would be the fundamental base cost of anything. And traditionally, in a country or in any market, if the cost of something disentangles from the base underlying cost of the price, it should come down because there's no demand. But here what we do is we're filling the gap with all sorts of ruses of equity to buy and this, that, mortgage, or whatever. Why is the cost of property disentangled from the cost of labor?
If I knew exactly why, I'd love to give you the exact answer. And in fact, I'm undertaking some research at the moment. We got a philanthropic donation to Trinity to look at construction costs in a sample of cities, 10, 12 cities, including Dublin, but many of its peers, to try and find out, the nitty gritty around why, almost down to the nuts and bolts of why it's so expensive. But one of the issues, as you say, it's where labor costs are high. Remember, the lesson we learned from the Great Depression way back when is that wages go up easily, but they don't come down easily.
Yeah.
And when you put wages up, like wages in construction increased phenomenally during the period, say 1998 to 2008. And one of the reasons was we actually had these kind of tax reliefs around building, which created phenomenal demand for labor in construction, which of course pushed up the wage. But then the crash happens, and bonuses and overtime and that kind of stuff did take a hit. The nominal rates were very sticky coming down. So you kind of get the good times, and then you don't necessarily get the bad times. Now, a construction worker would say, well, yeah, I was unemployed, but that's your margin. It's like either the wage goes down or you suffer unemployment. And we saw huge unemployment in the construction sector.
Even if wages are high in the construction sector, it should not be the case that the average or above averagely paid worker finds it impossible to find a place to rent or buy because the market, the construction market, is unwilling. It's not that it's unable, it's unwilling to actually do its job.
So I said we were going to move on to optimistic stuff, but I'll do one more pessimistic stat. In 2016, I took a look at the minimum requirements for a 2-bedroom apartment in Dublin. And you're thinking about this exactly the right way. This is what I want government, not just here, elsewhere, to do as well, is that what's the cost of your minimum spec? You set a minimum spec, great. How much does it cost to build it, even if land were free? And how high up the income distribution do you need to be to afford that? Nobody had done that thinking on the policy side in Ireland. So they had set a minimum spec 2-bed that was only affordable for the top 10% of the income distribution. Imagine that you've priced out 90% of the income distribution from a minimum spec 2-bed.
Ronan, that begs the question, what sort of gobshites are making policy here? And I'm really serious, because like, this is, you know, if, for example, the minimum spec raises the price of apartments to well out of the reach of the average person who you're trying to help, then you've got a sort of, not only an intellectual problem, you've got an honesty problem. You've actually an ethical problem, you have a moral problem.
So I kind of view this as, there's a lot of economism, and David, you probably know this term, you know, people adopting the language of economics to justify their decisions. Oh, we couldn't possibly raise the minimum wage because, you know, I did Econ 101 and this will happen or that will happen. And, it's rarely backed by research, but they sound like they know what they're talking about.
Have you noticed that physicists don't face the same problem? You don't get kind of armchair physicists in the pub giving their
you should go on Twitter.
Right. Okay.
There's certainly armchair epidemiologists on Twitter.
Oh, there are. Listen, I'm one of them every night. I'm saying, I'll tell you about COVID.
But what economism aside, and people kind of adopting the language of economics to kind of move to make a point they would make anyway because of their kind of personal preferences, there is actually a lack of training in economics in Ireland, in the Irish administration. There was an incredible stat in the Department of Finance in 2007. There was, I think, one person who had, economics qualifications above the level of an undergrad. And you know, if that happens, is it any wonder that you miss things? And here, and I actually cover this. Shameless plug. I have an online course in the economics of the property market, and that's one of the main things I try and say is that it's not that regulations are bad. That is absolutely not the point. It's that regulations bring benefits, but they may bring opportunity costs, and you've got to understand if you, for example, introduce a requirement that every new home has to be, basically near zero in terms of its net emissions. That's a great idea from a social point of view. But if you're pricing out, 20% of the income distribution, what countervailing measures are you going to give those? Because they're being disadvantaged by the measure. It could be the case that you give them grants by the Sustainable Energy Authority or whatever.
No, I'm with you. All right, well, let's look at positive things that can be done. The first thing I always, like a lot of people always think is there a place anywhere that we can figure out or we can look at that was faced with these sort of constraints, these sort of problems, and fixed it? I mean, historically, is there an example of a country or even a city that said, okay, we have, I mean, when you go to cities, I'm always intrigued. I was in, you go to big Latin American cities, and then you read a little bit about their population, and you realize the population of this city grew from 20,000 to 2 million in 12 yeyears, right? Okay. Your Buenos Aires, your Rio de Janeiro, these sort of things. It has happened before, right? And they fixed it. They came to terms with it. Are you looking that way, saying, okay, it happened here, we can do it there? Or sorry, it happened there, we can do it here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a constraint in terms of political realism. Like, so a lot of those cities will have scaled up, as indeed Dublin did in the 18th century, and a few other Irish cities did. They scale up, but without any kind of threshold on quality. So you get people living in all sorts of housing. They make it work, but it's not something that you could.
Are you saying that Rathmines and Ranelagh are not the swankiest houses in Ireland? Because they were very interesting developments. Fisra, Drumcondra, Rathmines, Ranelagh, of high density relative to what went before, housing that was delivered quite quickly.
Well, they were the Protestant streetcar suburbs. So when the trams were introduced in Ireland, it was a way for the largely kind of Protestant upper middle professional classes to escape the dirt of the city. And they set the price of the trams high enough that if you were if you weren't in the upper part of the income distribution, you couldn't afford the tram in and out every day. That's a story for a different day, I think.
That's a great story. Actually, I'm looking for an Irish Times column for this week. I'm going to talk to you afterwards.
We'll chat afterwards.
That's a good yarn. Okay, but I come back to it. Let's talk constructively? Is there a place that you say, let's do that?
What I would say is that because of our circumstances, there isn't one place where you can say they've got every element of the solution that we need. What I do think, actually, I hadn't thought of this until you raised it, it's important for us also to understand that our circumstances are different. Often I come up with the argument, say on Twitter or elsewhere, and people would say, oh, look what they did in Berlin, or look what they did in Barcelona. Why can't we do that here? And we certainly could. And there are certain measures that they may have done that would work well. But often if you're talking about a city, and not those two, but if you're talking about a city that has stable demand for housing versus a city that has huge increases year on year, the same solutions aren't going to work. But to go back to your question, what I would do is I would look to somewhere like Vienna for how it provides social housing. Okay. And I'd look to somewhere like Copenhagen for how they do zoning and land tax, or Tallinn. There are elements that we can adopt from different systems that would be appropriate for Cork or Galway or Dublin or Ireland more generally now. And I think those, in particular, those are the two key ones for me. Land value tax to get land used better, in terms of kind of silver bullets, and cost rental. And what I mean by cost rental is a lot of our social housing over the last 30 years has been market-driven social housing. If the market provides 50,000 homes a year, X% will be set aside for social. And if you think about that, that's a banana system, because the housing need isn't going to flip-flop overnight, but the market could. So if the market provides nothing, all of a sudden you get 10% of nothing, which is, you don't have to do a degree in economics to know that 10% of zero is zero. My 5-year-old's just learning fun with zeros. He's like, oh yeah, 0 times 0 is 0. You get nothing out of a system where you're reliant on the market for social housing at exactly the right time when you need most social housing. So cost rental is about separating from the market and getting social housing provided in accordance to need. And it's, as the name suggests, it's how expensive is it to provide housing for this person? And you charge them a rent that reflects that cost rather than a profit. And then if their income is too low, you top up their income so that they can afford it. And that's the system in Vienna, and it's done through non-profit housing bodies, and it works quite well. I wouldn't say it works perfectly, but it works significantly better than what we have.
Why don't we do that here? I mean, again, let's come to the impediments. So you've identified, look, the Danes have figured out zoning, and they figured out capacity, they figured out mass, they figured out density. The Austrians in Vienna have figured out cost and separating. So if you want to buy a swanky apartment, off you go, do it. But actually, we're going to look after the people who can't afford that. That seems pretty logical. I've heard it. I'm convinced, right? So what's the problem?
And here's where we can be really optimistic, right? I actually think things are getting better in terms of a housing policy in Ireland. When we go through that kind of that four-way list, mortgage rules, construction costs, cost rental, and a land value tax. If they're the four kind of key elements to your healthy housing system. I wrote that list up in maybe 2013 or something, and I said, and I still believe it's true, right? It covers most of the key elements of the housing system, and over time, the central bank came along and introduced its mortgage rules at a time when we could have returned to another bubble. In 2014, the price of Dublin housing was up 25% year on year. It had kind of worse inflation than at any point in the Celtic Tiger. And the central bank stepped in at that point and said, no, we're linking mortgages to income. So it stepped in at the right time. Now, the problem for me has been over the last, since then, none of the other four items has been ticked, right? The other three items has been ticked. Earlier this year, the government, in its Housing for All plan, it had been talked about for a while, but cost rental is just sort of in the door now in terms of social housing in Ireland.
But this is amazing, Ron. Like this is a bit like having a conversation with somebody who said, well, that free education malarkey we came up with in the 60s. Well, actually, that wasn't a good idea at all. And only those people who can afford education should get education. Is there a sort of a reticence? Could you do a figure, leaving the top of your head, and say, okay, we've got to produce X number of social housing. The people who live in those will never, ever be able to pay the rent that equates with the cost. So that cost is going to be borne by the rest of us, right? It can be borne either in taxation, or it can be borne in some sort of financial engineering, a long-term bond that we just cover the rate of interest at 1%. And frankly, that means we don't cover it, okay? It's just part, right? And we say, okay, the figure is 2 billion quid. And that's what we're going to do, right? So we're going to take all this bullshit out about the market and this and that. We're actually going to go, and the state is going to subsidize the homes of poorer people. And in so doing, we will scare the hell out of the market, because we'll say there is an alternative. But it means that the builders still get paid, right? But the actual taxpayer takes on the responsibility of their neighbors.
Yeah.
Why not?
The only thing limiting that, and I completely agree, I did a submission to the Oireachtas where I went through these kind of 4 headings, and it was called, basically, it wasn't called Housing for All, it was called, I can't remember now, because all I can think of is the government's Housing for All. This is about 5 years ago. I said, like, if you want to make a right to housing meaningful, this is how you do it. You say, either you're in the market or you're in the social housing sector. And if you want to make sure that the bill for the social housing sector, once you've made that commitment, is as feasible as possible for taxpayers, you do something like cost rental. The problem we have at the moment is, once you qualify, you're sort of in, and then you get this full size benefit, and you could have a 0 income or €1 below the threshold, and you're getting the same benefit.
But equally, you know, that they are. I'm not saying they're semantics, because that's what politics is about, those moments or those events. But the general principle, a little bit like saying Irish kids go to national school, they don't pay, right? We pay the teachers, we pay the buildings, we pay the land, we pay the cost, we pay the electricity, we pay the whole shenanigans, right? Because we believe that socially this is the right thing to do. And if you look at any indication about housing, housing is ultimately about dignity. And if you look at people who don't have a roof over their heads, they fail on every single metric in comparison to those of us who have a roof over our heads, because the profound instability, it relates to diet, it relates to application, it relates to education, all those things. So we know that a society that provides the dignity of housing actually probably ends up paying less in other bills down the road, health, education, yada, yada, okay? And it also feels good that this is the type of society we are. And let's say we say the bill is, I'm going to plug, is it 10 billion? Let's say it is, right? But we raise a bond for 10 billion, we pay 1% a year. And the great thing is, at low interest rates, you get the money. So it's up to the investors. It's their problem if interest rates go up. It's not yours. You actually have the cash, right? It's in your hand, right? And you do, like, I was reading something about how Holland, I know it's a very odd thing, how the Dutch financed their dike and polder building in the 16th century. They issued these perpetual bonds, right? Yeah. Which they continue to pay. You can arrive at the bank, the Netherlands, with a piece of paper from the 16th and say, give us a couple of guilders, right? And using the financial alchemy, right, that is the bond market, they fixed it, they financed things. We could do the same.
Yeah, no, and I think like, if to sort of go to mix the number of homes and the amount of money needed, like, we're talking about a country that's building 20,000 homes a year at the moment, but probably needs to be building 50,000 a year.
So let's do the sums in the back of your head. So 50,000 at 200 grand.
Now, and the thing is, of the 50,000, you would want to be in a space where about 2/3 of those are able to cover their own costs, right? So you're straight away down to talking about social housing of 15, maybe 20,000. We'll call it 15,000 a year in social housing units, in homes. And now again, if you do the system right, not everyone has to get everything paid, right?
Which is about 3 billion a year.
Yeah, so you're talking about something
less than the
MICA,
which is less than the MICA compensation, apparently, according to the radio. So you're talking about 3 billion a year. Push that out over 100 years. It's done. Yeah,
and the problem here, right, and this is where I start to lose any fans along the way. The problem here is that
Don't worry about that.
Yeah, we have a sort of an elephant in the room, which is that if you look at how the state has been spending its money over the last, say, certainly 10 years and even longer, is that almost all the increase goes to health. We haven't got a control on healthcare spending, and healthcare gets kind of first call on additional spending. So, and even worse, unintended increases in healthcare spending in one year are then rolled into the figure for the next year. We accidentally spent $1 billion too much.
But that's okay. But that's that. I tell you that the budget accounting of the state is a little bit. It's kind of incontinent. It kind of dribbles, and then it continues to dribble, and it's never fixed. But we'll come back to the housing market. My point is, if wealthy people want to have posh apartments, nice places to live, all that. That's fine. The market can sort that out.
Yeah.
But what happens, from my understanding of housing, is that if you don't build enough apartments at the very, very top, and I want to come back to it because I know you take a lot of flack this. Basically, the people who would have bought swanky apartments buy the apartments that used to be bought by people in the middle. And the people in the middle buy the homes that used to be bought by people at the bottom. And the people at the bottom get thrown into the skip, which is the lower end of the rental market. And you get this shunting on effect. So the idea is that the housing market has to be like a living organism. It has to say there are rich people, there are poor people, there are middle people, there are people who don't particularly want to spend much on housing and want to go on holidays. There's people who want to live in flats. There's people who don't want to live in flats. Do you see what I mean? So you've got to build a bit of everything in order for the thing to recalibrate.
And here's where I go back to sort of blaming that idea of economism, is that if I go out, and you probably get it too when you're chatting on Twitter and you say, more supply will help the situation. And you get people coming back going, no, economics doesn't work in housing. And it's like, it does. We know it does. All the rigorous scientific studies show that if you increase the supply, you make it more available and affordable. There's a really interesting study actually on the point that you made. There's a really interesting study in Helsinki that came out earlier this year. And they were able to track, to have 200 apartment blocks built over the last decade in Dublin, but they had in Helsinki. So they're able to track the impact of those blocks because they have kind of national registers. So they can go into the population data and see. And it's exactly as you describe. The problem is people are like, oh, you're just describing trickle-down economics. And we know we don't like that from the 1980s, right? It's not about that. It's about, it's a very mechanical process that these people live in the newly built homes. And even if the newly built homes are aimed at the top third of the income distribution, where would those people live otherwise? And this is true, say, of purpose-built student accommodation as well. Yeah, okay, maybe it's mostly international students that live in them, but where are they going to live if you don't build those? They're going to live in the
houses that used to be owned by poor people, used to be the homes of poor people. And the poor. So it's that idea that the whole thing shunts. It's all interrelated. Now, I know that let's focus on that issue, because what seems to me at the moment is that you mentioned the site value tax, right? It comes from, by the way, if you're watching this is a very old idea. It comes from a geezer called Henry George, who wrote a book called Poverty and Progress in, I think, about 1888 it was published. It ended up in the 1890s being the biggest selling book in the United States, bar the Bible. So that shows that economists can have popular books, by the way.
And not only that, it's the motivation for the board game Monopoly.
It is, exactly. It is the motivation for them. So basically it said land hoarding is the main reason that we have poverty. This is the big claim, which is quite interesting, right? And if we take out the incentive to hoard land, and we see it all over the city, right? Every second derelict site, dereliction needs to be taxed to the hilt in order to, and the incentive to do it up needs to be there in order to get rid of these eyesores, and also to actually make sure that huge areas of the city don't become redundant, because that's what's happening. But tell me about tell everyone about the Henry George idea and why you think that's essential. And then the next question I want to say, what will Sinn Féin do when they get into power?
Well, one step at a time. The best way I could think about explaining the land value tax idea is some of the people on today might be familiar with London, and in the late 90s there was an extension to they opened the DLR and they extended the Jubilee, or the other way around. I can't remember.
They extended it and they opened the DLR. I think they did both at the same time.
And in doing that, think of what they did to the areas that got served. The areas that got served had all of a sudden better access to the centres of employment. Yeah. What do you think happened to the value of property? Well, it's actually the value of land underneath the property went up. Yeah. It went up by more than the cost of it took to make the extensions. If you had a land value tax, you claim a fraction, say 5% of that upswing in the land value every year, and you can do what David describes. You can borrow initially and say, we're going to borrow 3 billion pounds to make this extension, and we're going to pay it back from the land value upswing at the other side. No, the taxpayers in Birmingham and Glasgow and Belfast don't have to lift a finger for this thing that's going to benefit the London system. Of course, what happened in England, or what happened in the UK, was it was funded out of general taxation. So you get people everywhere funding this thing that benefits private landowners in London. And that's sort of land value tax in a nutshell is recouping for society what society has created in the first place, which is it's society either directly by sort of hiring engineers to build a train, or indirectly by sort of coming together and making certain places centers of employment or valuable. Society has made land valuable, not the individual, and therefore it's just for society to claim some of that back every year as a sort of return on its investment. And when you see it that way, it's an amazing wealth on the tax on wealth. The vast majority of our wealth is ultimately in the form of real estate. So if you want to tax wealth, you want to be in favor of taxing land and property, but it's also a way of paying for these kinds of investments. So if they're talking about metros this week in Dublin, if you wanted to pay for a metro, if it really would pay for itself, then you could do it entirely through a land value tax.
Why don't we do that? Because let's go to the solutions, because I'm going to go now to the Q&A. Sorry, because I was just
we've got a bunch of them there.
But why don't we do that? And if you were to advise the next government, if you were to be sitting there and they came in and said, look, what should we do about this, right? Because the political economy of this is so obvious to everybody, which is that the party that convinces the electorate that they will fix this will get elected. That's whether they'll do it or not, they convince the electorate. Why would you not do something like this?
I'm going to take your question as sort of rhetorical and say that the two things I see that limit our ability to respond to the challenge of housing. The first is a sort of a bias, an understandable bias on the part of administrations to do things incrementally rather than wholesale. Let's figure out, at the margin, if cost rental will work, if we do sort of 500 cost rental units, or let's do land value tax just on this one site first and see if it works. And bit by bit, we can move in the right direction. The optimist in me says, okay, at least we're heading in the right direction, but we're inching, not leaping in the right direction.
We need to leap.
The second element, which feeds, the 2 feet onto each other, is that housing takes time between the decision and the benefits. So I'll give an example that some people might actually, certainly at the start, disagree. Let's see if I can win them over. In 2018, the Irish government introduced build-to-rent planning codes. And the idea here was to increase the supply of private rental accommodation in a country that had seen sort of no new rental accommodation for over a decade. I'm going to say that policy was a huge success, right? Or it is in the process of being a huge success. So there's about 30,000 apartments underway in Dublin for the rental market. In a rental market that is probably shy, it's missing 70 to 80,000, that 30 or maybe even 40,000 with more recent planning permissions, they're hugely welcome. But the problem is Irish people reacted to those earlier this year because of a different issue. And they reacted to those before we got a chance to see the benefits. So the government had to start taking kind of like backward steps and saying, oh, no, well, we're not going to rely on foreign savings to fund the construction of new rental accommodation as much or nearly as much as we originally thought. But the problem is that it's normally kind of 5 to 7 years between making a decision and seeing the effects. Yeah. And of course, an election happens every 3 to 5 years. So there's a mismatch in the timing of the politicians, and there's a conservatism on the part of the officials.
Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to go to but don't you think that the way to obviate that is to do the buy to rent, but also to do this social housing thing? So at the same time, you have public housing going up. So people say, well, look, you can complain about this, but we're also doing this. Whereas what people are seeing now
exactly
exclusively the buy to rent and the build to rent, but they're not actually seeing the social housing at the same time. Yeah. So they're saying, well, hold on a second, you guys are selling the state out to property funds, and we will end up financing them for the next 40 or 50 years, which is why their valuation on Wall Street has gone through the roof. Particularly
as you say, it's not either or. Sometimes people are like, if we're building 20,000, the 20,000 should be social housing, not rental units. It's like, well, actually, we should be building 50,000, 15,000 of them social, 10,000 of them rental, and the rest for owner occupiers. And it's all not one of the above.
Let's go. I'm going to take 3 or 4 questions together. Stephen McNamee. These chats don't focus enough on the supply of builders, actual plumbers, actual carpenters. We need to make apprenticeships much more attractive. Okay, and give tax relief to attract Irish builders back from abroad. One question. Second question, would favourable alternatives to property investing take pressure off the property market? For example, if you had a large amount of cash, this is from William Kennedy, who clearly does, aside from a pension where the contribution is capped, is there no attractive asset investment in Ireland? Okay, and Sharon Riley says, how much evidence is there that countries such as Germany have got it right? I presume that's alluding to something I said earlier. There's not a lot of discussion about unaffordable housing. Is there not a lot of discussion about unaffordable housing and lack of supply there? Okay, Roland, Stephen, William, and Sharon, thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks to everyone. We'll see if we can get through all 25, huh? Stephen, you're absolutely right. The capacity of the sector, I can talk, not blithely, but I can talk without kind of having to worry about the constraints. But going from 20,000 to 50,000, it means having a lot more. Now, the good news is, the paradoxical good news is, we pay typically quite good wage rates in construction in Ireland compared to other parts of Europe. We tend not to have a problem attracting people here as long as there's mobility, and COVID has affected mobility. But that aside, you're absolutely right to highlight capacity constraints as an issue. And that's why I think construction costs have to be front and center for the government as they think about scaling up social housing and scaling up all the construction of all kinds of homes. William, I would kind of take the opposite view, actually. The pressure in the housing market is not because of too much interest from investors. The pressure is, if anything, we need more investors coming in and investing in property. Now, I do think there's an unlevel playing pitch, if that's a phrase, between property and other asset classes. Owner occupiers are the most tax privileged of all of the actors in the housing market. You don't pay any capital gains tax. You've by the standards of other countries, a minimal property tax on an annual basis. It's an incredibly privileged, tax privileged way of existing. And Sharon, and hopefully some of the remarks I suggested kind of lead you to believe I agree with you. I wouldn't be looking for the place that got it right, because every place has its own issues. Every place has something wrong. And indeed, in Germany, over the last 5 or so years, they're starting to see some of the issues that have bubbled up elsewhere over the last sort of 20 to 50 years in terms of a lack of new housing getting built. And you saw in Berlin, one response to the lack of rental accommodation was they wanted, the voters have suggested to the council to expropriate all of the institutional landlords. Which I don't think is a clever idea from a long run supply point of view. You might get a sort of a short run win, but a long run loss.
Okay, interesting. So Graham Power, there's 2 questions. I'm going to ask the first one. What can be learned from planned economies, especially in planned housing? Okay, that's the first one. Stephen begs, could it be suggested that the government introduce some sort of freezing on buying for existing homeowners wishing to buy a second or even multiple properties? And Vicky Byrne, do you believe that incorrect supply is being provided at the moment as we are in a crisis? This will lead to issues down the line with planning for high density units being approved in areas with little infrastructure.
So on Graham's first question there, I think we have a conception of the housing system as a market, but the government controls almost every element of housing in a system like Ireland and in a system like the US or wherever. The idea in theory and in practice, this should be beneficial, is that the government sort of directs the market into what it wants done. But we certainly, I mean, the bubble crash 2000 to 2012 was not a market failure. It was entirely a policy failure. Policy didn't understand the link between credit and house prices. People like David were shouting on the TV about it, and policy didn't respond. And likewise, we had tax credits for building homes where there was no long-term demand. So we ended up with a significant oversupply of housing in, for example, the Upper Shannon region. And that is entirely policy-driven. There is absolutely no way the market would have built homes in Longford or Leitrim at the volume it did if there were no tax credits there and if there was no failure in relation to the supply of credit. I don't want to come across as some sort of pro-market fundamentalist here. I'm just saying that we need to diagnose the problems, and the problems are policy problems rather than market ones. Stephen, and this kind of goes a little bit like William's question earlier. The problem for me is not that we have sort of too many second-time buyers buying properties willy-nilly and pricing out first-time buyers. The problem is that we don't have enough homes, and anything that and we don't have enough rental homes. So anything that limits that, I would view with skepticism. So discouraging people from investing in rental homes, I'm wary of. Not that I want everyone to be a renter. I don't. I just think in a city like Dublin, in a country like Ireland, we're going to need about 20 or 30% of our housing stock as rental in some form. And that means adding 15, 20,000, maybe more rental homes every year for the next 4 decades. And discouraging that, as I say, I'm kind of wary of. And Vicky has a question about incorrect supply.
Yes.
Short answer, yes. We're building, over the last 10 years, we've built rural one-offs. We should have been building urban apartments and similar kinds of housing.
Okay, David McReynolds says, I'm an early career dentist on a decent salary. I've paid down my student debts. I've got a first-time deposit ready for next September. It's a nice apartment. So I want a nice apartment somewhere in Dublin city centre. Should I really stay out of the housing market if I can afford somewhere decent next year? By the way, okay, so that's a suggestion I came up with. I'll answer that in a second. It's a buyer strike idea. Andrew McLaughlin says, Orla Hegarty has said there's 40,000 houses and apartments with planning permission ready to go, so our planning process isn't the problem. Ronan Fahy says, do suppliers of building houses make up for a lot of the costs, or is it mostly developers cut labour costs, delays in planning, etc.? So that's where's that chunk that's propelling us away from the baseline cost that should be income, and income for the vast majority of people is your wage.
Yeah.
Okay. Connor says, what do you think of setting a 2% inflation target for houses at a reasonable level? And Katrina Lawler says, I agree with Ronan that social housing should be cost rental. It's the best way forward. I'm trying to look at the question here.
I think it's somebody agreeing vehemently with me, which is always nice to see.
Okay, all right, fair enough. So take those and we move on. Sorry about that, Katrina. I'm trying to find the question, but if I'll read this while Roland's answering. If there is a question, I'll be definitely back to it. Otherwise, you're absolutely right. Sure, the man's got the answer for everything. You're absolutely right. Go for it. Go for it.
So Andrew, yeah, I mean, Orla and myself see things very differently. I mean, that's reasonably obvious to me when I interact with her, that she's a different take. And it's great, I think dissent is important. And, people like David back in the early 2000s brought a different view. And I think one thing that makes policymaking better.
By the way, sorry, brought a very accurate view, not a different view, one that was actually right. In fact, I believe, just to introduce that we went back to we talked about economism, right? And I really do believe, and it's a big thing, that the failure 10 years ago or 15 years ago now was a failure of the Irish economics profession to actually stand up and say something is going on here which is wrong. And I think when we say policy, there's a lot of people inputting to policy, and I suspect that we got, like, the Irish economics profession got it wrong because they are not really good at monetary economics. They're not really good at credit. They're not really good at credit cycles. And if we get into another credit cycle, and I suspect we will, or we are in it, those mistakes should be made again. I'm very sorry about that, but so it's
no, you're fine. And my point was, suppose, and it's not the case, but suppose you even had been wrong.
Yep.
It's important to have people who have a different view, because even if you're wrong, you question the people who are right, and you make them stronger in their thinking, that they have to listen to another point of view and go, actually, why do I believe what I believe? Anyway, that's not the question. Was specifically about, Orla had a point about
40,000 houses ready to go.
I mean, that's less than a year's supply. It's the planning system. It's hard to argue when someone, when you see these sites that have been going for 20 years, and the planning/legal system, right, in its entirety, has failed to give a clear decision. I think it's kind of hard to argue that there's nothing wrong with that. It's not about the quantity, it's about the process, which I think goes to Ronan's point. It's the nature of the process. Denmark, not that we want necessarily more data centers, that's a different point, but Apple announced it was going to build a data center in Denmark and build one in Galway. They had opened their first in Denmark and were starting their second by the time the court case in Ireland was beginning. And it's not about that the planning system is has to be fast and therefore it's going to be pro-market. It's that you have a clarity in the decision-making process, that you have a process, people's views are considered, a decision is made, and then you go off on that. In Ireland, we're at the European Court of Justice now for a development in Dublin 8, a massive brownfield site that could provide lots of housing, and it could be, 3 years off in the ECJ. Conor has a point. I would be more ambitious and say a 2% target for inflation is go for zero, right? That if supply is adequate, the cost of housing should never go up. Now, maybe I wouldn't get re-elected by promising that the value of your home would never go up, but maybe 0 to 2 is more realistic to aim for. But I do think, and the European Central Bank is coming around to this view, that it wants to put in owner-occupied housing into its measure of inflation. Because, going back to David's point, the mistake economics and monetary policy makers made in the 90s and 2000s was to think that the interest rate that they were looking at captured everything. It didn't, and they made a big mistake. And what was known as the Great Moderation at the time, we now look back and laugh at it and say the Great Moderation led to the Great Recession.
The great amplification, it should have been called.
Yeah.
Okay, Lorraine Curtis, the value of land is linked to potential development plus desirability, i.e. location. Hold on a second, where's Lorraine gone? Okay, we're taxing people at 40%, but not the hoarding of land. So our question is, obviously, we should be looking at hoarding taxes, okay? Trying to get things going, etc. So that's Lorraine. Hold on, every time you come in, I keep losing this. I'll just go for Brendan Ryan. The market requires a buyer and seller, somebody buying Dublin houses at huge multiples of average earnings. If they were not, prices would fall. Who are the buyers exactly interested? Are the cash buyers, the returned immigrants? Interesting question. Let's go to Stephen to somebody new. Conor Gillespie. What will the effect on young people in the future being priced out of foreign investment so needed? Okay, yeah. So the link between, it's all very well getting lots and lots of companies in here, but if people can't live here, then you'll run out of labor. Not because you've run out of labor, because labor can't live close. Okay, take those three and we move on.
I'll see if I can do them in reverse order, and I might need your help, David, on which one was which. So if you have, like, the problem is that pricing out's already happened. Over the last 10 years, we didn't build any rental accommodation. The cost of rental accommodation doubled, and Ireland has lost jobs it could have easily won. In the kind of the post-Brexit scramble, Frankfurt was able to say, look, we have all these rental homes, they're good to go. You set up here, okay, you'll be in Frankfurt, but at least your workers will have somewhere to live. I think that was more or less their pitch. In Dublin, it was like, look, you could live in Dublin. Now, yes, the housing isn't great, but don't worry about that. There's pubs to go to. You'll be fine. You won't be in your home that much. You won't be in your bedroom in a 3-bed out and whatever that much. You'll be in town having a great time. And so we've already lost the labor, we've already lost the jobs, and the change in 2018 to enable new rental homes to get built, that was to try and capture some of that. And in a city like Dublin, and again, I don't want to be too overly focused on Dublin, but the city should be providing something like, at least if it were in balance, a few thousand, because it's behind, probably between 10 and 20,000 new rental homes every year for the next few years in order to catch up for lost ground. Now, as David said, that's not instead of, it's in addition to social housing and owner-occupied housing. And that's where the political problem came, because it would seem to be like the only one. But that's not the fault of the investors that they're able to borrow cheaply and afford to build 650 grand apartments. It's the fault of the cost base, and therefore of policymakers not watching the cost base to monitor that. And let me see if I can find the other one.
The question on land hoarding, the idea being, you tax income at 40%.
If a land value tax at 2% is effectively a 40% income tax on the income from your land.
Explain
you think
that.
of as the yield is about 5% a year from land. So if you're taxing 5% it's 100% income tax on land. And if you tax 2%, it's a 40%. And that's kind of the range I would suggest for land value tax, somewhere between 2 and 5% per year in the value of the land. And you're making sure that people will be able to assemble sites, but they won't be able to speculatively hoard land.
Brendan's question is just basically, it's like, who the hell are these buyers? Right, that's Brendan's question. And you answer that and I'll move on, because he's basically saying, look, things have gone so far out of whack. Who the hell is coming up with with the cash?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest buyer in the market at the moment is government in various forms. It's I think 25% or so transactions. Maybe that fraction is wrong, but the last time I looked at the figures, it was by far the biggest buyer of homes. Institutional funds were, I think, about 10%. Plus or minus. First-time buyers were the biggest group, bigger than government. So there have been an extraordinary increase in the number of people who've been able to save over the last 2 years or so. That is kind of one. But they're bouncing up at the very limit of the central bank rules. You can see that the loan to income limits are, it's a ceiling now that lots of people are pushing up against. So it's certainly the case that it can't increase at anything like the pace we've seen over the last 10 years.
Just the other thing I think we talk about, it's not for now, but it's worth considering the extraordinary role of inheritance and already wealthy people financing their already wealthy kids. It's a big deal. It's unbelievably inequitable. And I think it's one of the major factors that is, so you have deposit inflation. So those people who actually are working to get the deposits are being elbowed out by those who are getting 30, 40, 50,000 from.
And you overlay on top of that the fact that this could come down to whether your parents happen to be in Ireland in the year 2000 or not. There's going to be people born in Ireland whose parents had a home, and there's going to be people who were born in Ireland whose parents moved to Ireland in 2005. And they are going to have very different trajectories, because they won't be, one will be able to lean on a parental deposit when their time comes, and the other won't. And that will introduce a new dynamic, I think, into Irish politics.
And very interestingly, I can see Amy is back in the room. So it means that we are out of time, unfortunately. There's a little bit like a kind of a game show there at the end, but there you go in terms of trying to answer as much as we could. But I think I'd leave you with the thought that Ronan just touched on there, which is the serendipity of birth in Ireland. That the year, because this country has not really come to terms with credit booms and busts, because its monetary policy has been sometimes harnessed onto other objectives, okay? What is something extraordinary in the last 40 or 50 years in Ireland, the year you were born probably has a greater impact onto your wealth and the way in which you live in this society than maybe any other Western European society. So if you're born in Italy in the late 60s or the late 50s, or maybe even say the mid 80s, your general life is not going to be profoundly affected by your birthday. Whereas in Ireland, if you were born in the late 90s, you're basically coming into this market now. If you were born in the late 70s, there's a good chance your parents will be bankrupt. If you were born in the late 50s, there's a good chance you wouldn't be here because you've emigrated. So I think if
I thought you said you were going to be cheery.
No, but I'm just saying, if we could, I'm just saying, look, I'm just going on a riff on the basis of the last conversation.
I'm only teasing you.
Thanks so much, guys.
The idea is that we have to eradicate in Ireland the fact that the year you were born is significant to your subsequent prospects. If we do that, we'll be well on our way.
Thanks, David. Thanks so much, guys. Definitely food for thought there. That was absolutely fantastic talk and brilliant audience questions. Sorry again if we didn't get to all of them, but just a sincere thank you to Ronan and David again for so generously giving us their time today. I'm sure all the alumni listening in really enjoyed that and learned so much. I definitely learned a lot there, so thank you so much. Also like to thank my colleague Alexandra Owens, who's helped put this webinar together. And if you'd like some more information on the topics discussed today, you can check out some of the links at the bottom of our screen there for Ronan's website, ronanlyons.com, where you can find out more about his research and also the property economics course that he referenced there. And David McWilliams' podcast series is available on Spotify and Apple also. And there's a link to the daft.ie house price report there. We'll send all these links in a follow-up email in the next couple of days. But just to let you know that the next webinar in the series is in 2 weeks' time on the October 20th at 1 p.m. again. And it's on Trinity in Translation, Connecting Cultures Through the Centuries, with Professor Michael Cronin and Professor Carol O'Sullivan. So that will be a really interesting one, a very engaging conversation where you can learn all about Trinity's history, ongoing contribution and legacy in the area of literary translation. The registration links will be emailed in the next couple of days. And just to say thanks again for joining us and take care.